So we are recording this so that we can send it out later. And with that, Cassie, I turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Jessica. Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us today, especially, during Domestic Violence Awareness Month. So we are going to be, during this month, we have been looking at different myths and misconceptions concerning domestic violence. Today, we are going to start with the misconception in our Fact or Fiction series, only low-income families experience domestic violence. This is a common misconception that we hear a lot in the general public, as well as some professional platforms as well. And it is definitely false. The effects of domestic violence are far-reaching. Domestic violence exists in every level of society, all economic classes, regardless of country or community. This misconception could stem, we think, from the fact that lower income survivors typically seek help through social services, social service agencies, or public assistance offices when attempting to escape an abusive environment. And these services are usually subject to data tracking trends. So we think that is why we see this common statistic play out the way that it does. Domestic violence victims in the middle or higher income brackets sometimes have access to private resources, and they're typically more likely to seek help privately. This leads us to believe that domestic violence is underreported in these classes. Domestic violence is prominent in communities of affluence and privilege. But myths such as this one, that it only occurs in low-income families, often perpetuates the survivor's silence and suffering because they believe it is only happening to them and that they will not be believed in their circles. Abusers in these situations could be doctors, lawyers, politicians, or clergy. This also perpetuates the survivor's silence because it causes confusion for outsiders, or even for those that the victim might perceive as part of their support system, who don't know or can't accept that domestic violence happens in these settings as well. And while survivors in the middle class or upper class appear to be wealthy, financial abuse and other forms of abuse still exist in these situations, and they oftentimes have no real control over access to the family finances and face many difficulties when deciding to speak out or seek help. Being a low-income family does not cause domestic violence, though we do see poverty and other social issues intersect with the domestic violence. However, having a lower income is indicative of the struggle that this survivor and the children are faced with when trying to leave an abusive home. Low or no income individuals, especially those with children, rarely have the needed resources to escape the violence. And this typically significantly lengthens the recovery process for the survivor. Domestic abuse is all about power and control, and abusers will try to control their partner in any way that they can by limiting their access to finances and isolating them until they have no support system. Any support system that they previously had is gone. It is important to the abuser to cut those ties. They use manipulation tactics and abuse tactics to do that throughout the course of the relationship. And this makes it extremely difficult for the survivor. It creates a situation for the victim where they are uncertain of survival if they do leave. I've spoken with many survivors, especially those with children, who characterize this uncertainty, not knowing what is going to happen once they pass the point of leaving, as being just as intimidating for them as the violent environment that they have been navigating and surviving, because they have no idea how they are going to be able to care for themselves or their children. So we see that every survivor, regardless of class, faces their own unique set of difficulties when faced with escaping an abusive home. And addressing that situation requires available support programs and services for these survivors. who can offer crisis intervention and emergency shelter, as well as transitional services to help ensure long-term future stability, such as housing and childcare, employment assistance, ongoing emotional support through counseling services, these kind of things to help with long-term stability. So this is another common misconception we see. Domestic violence victims are usually uneducated and without job skills. This stems from the difficulty that domestic abuse victims go through when trying to maintain a job. Oftentimes they are enduring mental and physical abuse, sometimes daily, that greatly affects their ability to maintain a job and to work productively. According to Legal Momentum, which is the oldest legal advocacy group for women in the United States, intimate partner violence causes victims to lose the equivalent of 32,000 jobs per year in our country alone. Victims of abuse regularly have to take time off from work to seek medical attention for injuries related to the violence, to visit their doctor for declining health. We have seen statistics that show that people that are enduring abuse on a regular basis, they experience health problems, declining health, and/or anxiety disorders. They have to take time off to obtain an injunction for protection or engage in other court services if the perpetrator is charged. To relocate to a safe home or shelter, oftentimes with their children. And also when the abuser disables or damages their vehicle, causes an incident at their workplace, sabotages childcare opportunities. They'll do anything they can a lot of the times to control this situation and sabotage the employment for the victim. Domestic violence, again, is all about power and control. And there is no better way to control someone than by destroying their economic well-being and their livelihood. Any opportunity that they have to care for and support themselves. We have seen many states begin to pass laws recently to put protections in place for domestic violence in the workplace. This is something good and something that we advocate for regularly. These laws allow leave time for things such as court services, medical attention, counseling services, and defined service programs or shelter programs. You can find a state-to-state resource guide detailing these laws and other laws pertaining to victims' rights. It is available at womenslaw.org, which is a project of the National Network to End Domestic Violence. If you are someone that works with domestic violence victims or know someone that is a victim of domestic violence, it's a really good resource for finding information pertaining to victims' rights. And especially if you're thinking about relocating to another state or have someone that you're working with relocating to another state, it will give you an idea of the protections that are in place in that area. Another common misconception in our Fact or Fiction series, low self-esteem causes victims to get into an abusive relationship. This is also false. It is a common misconception that a strong individual or an individual with healthy self-esteem or high self-value would never allow themselves to be abused. This misconception is damaging because it takes responsibility away from the abuser where it belongs and puts it solely on the shoulders of the victim. And that is damaging for our victims. In reality, we see individuals come into the beginning of abusive relationships with their self-esteem healthy and their self-worth intact. Ultimately, they experience a decrease in self-value due to the abuser's constant degradation and abuse. And this is the ultimate goal of the abuser. The first stage in any domestic abuse pattern is to charm the victim and gain the trust. An abuser is never going to come into a relationship being vocal about their intentions. But the more that they can break down the will of the victim, the more vulnerable the victim becomes to remaining in the relationship. Fact or fiction, it's easy for a victim to leave an abusive relationship. If the abuse was that bad, they would leave. This is by far one of the most damaging misconceptions that we hear regarding domestic violence, because it leads to questions such as, why doesn't he or she just leave? Why does she stay? In reality, there are many, many reasons that a victim decides to stay that are all very genuine and real for her. Domestic violence victims are faced with a myriad of issues when they consider leaving their abuser. In most cases, they have been isolated and abused emotionally, physically, financially, verbally, to the point that they are completely dependent upon the abuser. They have no resources, they have no money, they will have no home. They're cut off basically from whatever support system they may have had at one time, and they have no idea how they will care for themselves and their children, and fear losing them in the fallout. Leaving is a process for these victims. It is not a one-time or a one-moment event. It's not a moment in time where she decides, okay, I can leave. I'm just going to, in this moment, walk out the door. It's a process that they have to go through. And that's why services like ours are so important in that time period. This misconception also wrongly implies that the violence would end if the victim would simply leave the situation. But statistics show that over 70% of domestic violence related murders occur after the victim has ended the relationship. So this is the most dangerous time for a domestic violence victim. It is exactly when they have made the decision to leave. It is at this point that the abuser fears or knows that they have lost control of the victim and have nothing else to lose. Other outcomes that we see on a regular basis are long-term stalking, even after the victim and or the abuser have remarried. We see that often. Regular denial of financial resources to help children and to help support children. I mean, manipulation of the court system to punish the victim, who is ultimately a lot of the times faced with the possibility of the abuser having unsupervised time with the children they have in common. So when you hear these questions like, why doesn't she just leave? It's not an easy process for these victims. There are many, many issues and many reasons that they stay. Why it's important to tackle these myths and misconceptions. This is a conversation we've had often here at Victim Services. These conversations need to be had, and they should be had often, not just as a passing moment in time or in headlines, because many of these myths and misconceptions regarding domestic violence perpetuate harmful implications for victims of this abuse. Questions such as, why does she stay, or why didn't she just leave, puts blame on the victim and adds an element of shame or guilt to an already stressful and traumatizing situation. In doing so, we are holding the victim responsible for the abuse they've endured, instead of recognizing that the abuse is the sole responsibility of the abuser. So questions and misconceptions like these perpetuate the victim's silence, and abuse thrives in silence. In every situation of domestic violence we see, in every case in which we speak with survivors and work with survivors, we see ways in which they have reached out many times repeatedly to end the violence, such as talking to friends or our family, seeking help from a church advisor, calling law enforcement, or seeking help from an outside organization. And a lot of the times these survivors have reached out repeatedly, either to friends and family or law enforcement, instead of asking, why does she stay, or why didn't he or she just leave? We should ask questions like, what makes the abuser believe that he is entitled to her life? Domestic violence services through Peace River Center of Victim Services is available in Polk, Hardee, and Highlands counties. These are crisis lines right here on the screen for Hardee and Highlands and for Polk. We do operate 2 domestic violence shelters, one in Lakeland for Polk County and one in Sebring for Highlands and Hardee County. There are people available at our crisis lines 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So I would encourage those needing help or seeking help to reach out to those numbers. And again, my name was Cassie Long, and I thank you for being with us today here at Peace River Center.
And Cassie, do you mind just going back to one of the slides I had pulled in? We're going to put it on social media, so stay tuned for that. But it had quotes at the top. It was from actually a survivor that Kirsten shared, just to kind of speak to the point where, people were like, how did they not see it coming? Or, how did, why did she not, why did she leave? Let's see, it was down a ways. Yeah, we'll just click through them. It had it at the top. You will, when you get there.
This one?
Okay. Yeah. So I just wanted to give people a moment to really read through that. We can even read it out loud to them, but this came from a survivor and just really speaks to the fact that, what the public sees is not always what the survivor is dealing with. And even what the survivor experienced during the beginning is not necessarily, what the truth really is. They, like you mentioned, charm them. And even when things are going well, I've heard a lot of times, and I'm sure you can speak more to this, that, when the abuser, the perpetrator is, being good, they can be very sweet, they can be very romantic, but it's the fact that they also have that dark side. So this quote just said, before my abusive relationship experience, I never understood why a woman would stay in a relationship with an abuser. It was very cut and dry to me and didn't make sense, which I feel like a lot of us probably are in those shoes. What I didn't realize from the outside is the abuse doesn't necessarily start out in a very obvious way. It creeps in slowly like a poisonous gas. The more you breathe in the gas, the less clear your thoughts become. By the time things start happening that a sane person would recognize as abuse, it's generally too late. You're no longer quite sane. And I know from a lot of what Cassie shared and what we see is that a lot of times that, friend circles have been cut off, family relations have been cut off. So that person is feeling very isolated. So the survivor went on to say, your sense of what has happened has been completely distorted by exhausting mental games and emotional torment. Your perception of reality has been twisted and manipulated so severely, you are no longer certain what to believe or who you are. And a lot of times that's what we call gaslighting, that they make the person feel like they might be going crazy, that they might have imagined the abuse. I think if someone hasn't experienced that, it's almost impossible to understand that you actually can be driven temporarily mad by another person. It's also because most abuse happens privately. If you weren't a victim, you probably only saw his best, most charming face. And if that was the person you knew, it would be hard to imagine the dark truth of what happens behind closed doors. Thank you for going back to that. I just felt like that really speaks to a lot of, the myths and so forth. When we're standing outside of the relationship, we don't understand it. And then sometimes by the time we are in, we missed the quote unquote red flags, or there weren't red flags until, we were isolated.
A lot of the times there are not red flags. And a lot of the times these, people that are capable of this kind of abuse, they don't come into the relationship announcing their intentions, and these quotes definitely speak to what survivors go through. With their perception of reality being twisted and manipulated so severely from the beginning, they use gaslighting and other manipulation tactics to accomplish that. And a lot of the times you just don't know the situation you're in until you're so far in that it's hard to see the light of day, definitely.
And then another question I had for you, and if anyone has any questions, feel free to use the chat feature again, the Q&A or the raise hand. Question I had was, we talk about this happens in higher income settings or medium, your medium income families, but a lot of times we don't, much like this quote talks to, we don't see it because that's not the persona that the abuser puts on outside. So can you just share with us a few of what are some of the warning signs that we as friends of people might be mindful of as we're, interacting with our friends, like what things should we be on the lookout for, so that if we are like, are you really safe? I know that actually in regular doctor's appointments, I've noticed that the doctors have started asking, do you feel safe at home? Because you're normally in there by yourself, and that would be an opportunity where they could link you to resources. But are there anything else we can look for?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Definitely, signs of physical abuse, definitely, such as bruises and that kind of thing, but also just signs of control, signs of control, or that the person is being controlled. A lot of the times you'll see a change in the demeanor of that person when the abuser is around. When the abuser is not around, that person is a completely different. They seem calmer, they seem happier, more relaxed than when the abuser is around. And just signs of control, the abuser speaking for the victim, not allowing them to have access to people or friends unless they're around some of the time. Just really elements of control is what you're looking for.
So even things like, if their wardrobe all of a sudden changes and they're like, oh, I thought you hated wearing dresses. And it's like, oh, well, now I'm only really wearing dresses because I'm being told that, but that's, being told to, but that's not what gets said. And then even eating and spending money, oh, when it comes shopping, oh, I can't, like,
oh, I can't. Yes. Yes.
Right. Being mindful of those things and picking up on those.
Or asking, yes. Or asking, asking for permission for things that you typically shouldn't have to ask permission for.
Perfect.
Yeah,
those
definitely things.
Great tips. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, does anyone else have any other questions? And one of the things I just like to share with everyone too, and I know you all do it in the program, is just that, a lot of times people think, oh, I can't access services unless I come into the shelter. And we do provide domestic violence services for people who are remaining in the community. So I think that that's a big part too, that if someone does have a support system where they can go and stay with someone that's safe and gets them out of that situation, that it's still 100% recommended to call our line and safety plan, because, like Cassie mentioned, that is the most dangerous time to leave. And it can go on. Like the other thing I think would be, to be aware that it doesn't just stop as soon as the relationship stops, that there are things that you'll need to be mindful of. Unfortunately, there's just so many stories of abusers that, again, after marriage and other children have come along, that they still are out there stalking and striking back to the people that left them. So that is why your support is so important and what you do is so important. So thank you so much, Cassie. We'll give it one more. Anybody, any other questions? Feel free to type those in.
And I would like to add too, a lot of the times if we can have contact with the survivor before they reach that point, a lot of times we can safety plan with them around the process of leaving. Just to, we have information we can give them and safety plans we can do just to try to make that process a little safer for them.
Wonderful. That's so important. Well, thank you. So, we do have a question. What is being done to reach abusers and re-educate or redirect these behaviors?
In my opinion, not enough. It is something that we discuss often in victim services and a lot of the times with DCF too, when we work with DCF. But unfortunately, at this time, most of the time, the survivor feels that the sole responsibility for the incidents or for the violence or everything that has happened has fallen square on her shoulders. And she's the one that has to try to pick up the pieces and go along. We have to get to a point that through reform efforts or conversations where we can hold perpetrators accountable for the violence that they inflict. And those are definitely reforms that we need to be looking at. I know that we do advocate for this a lot, especially with DCF right now, to hold perpetrators accountable, to give more support services to the victims, and that's where we come in. And I know that we are we are engaging in things like batterers intervention, that DCF refers batterers to and abusers to, but there needs to be more education and engagement on that side if we're ever going to really look at the bigger picture and tackle this problem. So that's a really good question. That is definitely something that we need to be looking at to make a real effect, a positive effect on domestic violence.
Right, to really work with, reshaping the anger and the control issues into something that, is not a negative and is not a threat to others, because, while one survivor may escape, that person may then get into another relationship with someone else. So
correct.
Definitely excellent question and excellent. And let me see, are you able to present this on Friday in a program? We are getting an extra program request. I love that so much. We will reach out to you to see if that will fit into our schedule. So thank you so much for asking. But if not, we are recording this, so we welcome you all to share the recording. But we will reach out to you as soon as the presentation's over to see if we can't get that set up. Perfect. Thank you. All right. Well, any other questions? Otherwise, thank you so much, Cassie, for all you are doing and for sharing these important myths and misconceptions with us. One of the things that we talk about during Domestic Violence Awareness Month is educating ourselves and empowering ourselves and sharing with others so that, more people understand that services are available and that, again, we always emphasize like confidential and free services. I tell people, like, even if you're just not sure, like you're worried about someone at work and you think you might have seen some signs, give us a call. We can talk you through those things, give you some ways to help someone else. So perfect. Thank you so much. If anyone has any additional questions, we will send out the recording. Feel free to respond to that email, but otherwise, thank you and have a wonderful day, everyone.